Truth versus tradition, Easter, resurrection, or religious rebranding.
You know, I had a bit of a surreal moment yesterday.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. I walked into the grocery store just to grab a gallon of milk, nothing fancy, and I was physically walled in by a fortress of pastel.
Ah, the seasonal aisle.
Yeah.
Does not believe in subtlety.
It really doesn't. It was aggressive. We're talking 5-foot towers of pink plastic brass, chocolate rabbits the size of toddlers, marshmallow chicks in colors that definitely do not exist in nature.
Just a full-on sensory assault.
Exactly.
Yes.
And enough plastic eggs to bury a small sedan.
Right.
But while I was standing there staring at a hollow chocolate bunny that cost like $20, I had this question pop into my head.
Yeah.
It's one of those uncomfortable questions you usually push down because you don't want to be that guy at the family gathering.
Right, the one ruining the fun. What was the question?
What on earth does any of this, the bunnies, the grass, the sugar coma, actually have to do with the resurrection of Jesus?
That is the big one.
I mean, seriously. If you dropped a Martian into an American church on Easter Sunday, they'd see a solemn, beautiful service followed immediately by children hunting for plastic eggs on the lawn. They'd be incredibly confused about what the central event actually is. Is it the empty tomb? Or is it the chocolate?
That is the question of the hour. And
Yeah.
honestly, it's a brave one to ask. We tend to just accept the Easter package as a single unit.
Right.
You get the theology and the chocolate all wrapped up together in cellophane. But for this deep dive, we're going to unwrap it. We are going to separate truth from tradition.
I really like that framing, truth versus tradition, because clearly we're dealing with a blend here. It feels like a mix of ancient history, theology, and, well, marketing.
It is exactly that. Our sources for this deep dive treat this like an investigation.
Okay, so let's set the parameters for that investigation.
The premise is simple. The resurrection is obviously central to the Christian faith. It's the cornerstone.
Yeah.
But the holiday we celebrate today, what we call Easter, is a massive, complicated accretion of history, linguistics, folk customs, and imperial politics.
It's not a straight line from the Bible to a chocolate bunny.
Not at all.
Okay, so let's trace that line. Because I think for most people, myself included, the assumption is if we do it in church, and we've done it for hundreds of years, it must be in the Bible.
Right.
But our mission today is to fact-check that assumption. We need to distinguish between the scriptural foundation and what the sources are calling religious rebranding.
Religious rebranding is a strong term, but it is accurate. To understand how we got here, we have to start at the absolute beginning. We need to look at the biblical baseline.
Before the cathedrals, before the empire, before the candy.
Exactly. What was actually happening on the ground?
Right. So let's contextualize the event physically and chronologically. According to the Gospels, when did the crucifixion and resurrection actually happen? If we looked at a calendar from the 1st century, what are we looking at?
This is critical. The Gospels are incredibly specific about this. Jesus was crucified during Passover.
The Jewish feast.
Yes, the entire timeline is anchored to the Jewish feast calendar. The Last Supper was a Passover meal. The crucifixion happens as the Passover lambs are being slaughtered in the temple.
Wow.
And the resurrection occurs during the Feast of Unleavened Bread and the First Fruits period.
So the original context wasn't a separate Christian calendar. It was happening right inside the existing Jewish holy days.
Precisely. The early believers were operating entirely within that Hebraic framework. They weren't checking a Gregorian calendar, which wouldn't exist for another 1,500 years anyway, to find a date in April.
Right.
They were looking at the moon. They were watching for the month of Nisan.
And here's where the sources threw a curveball that I really wasn't expecting. You scour the New Testament looking for the instructions on how to set up this holiday, and what you find?
Silence.
Exactly. Total silence. The New Testament never actually commands believers to create an annual resurrection holiday called Easter.
It's a silence that is deafening once you notice it. You can search the text, but you won't find a commandment that says, once a year, on the first Sunday after the first full moon of spring, you shall hold a festival.
Right.
There is no liturgy for an annual Easter service in the book of Acts.
That seems wild given how big the holiday is now. It's arguably the biggest day of the year for the church. So what were they doing? If they weren't having an annual Easter Sunday, were they just ignoring the resurrection?
Far from it. And this is a key distinction the sources make. The early church proclaimed the resurrection constantly. It wasn't a seasonal event. It was a daily reality.
Constant rather than annual.
Yes. They met on the first day of the week, Sunday, specifically to mark the resurrection. But they did this every week.
Yeah.
They didn't need a specific annual holiday because the reality of the risen Christ was the engine of their entire lives.
That's a really interesting psychological shift. If something changes your life every day, you don't necessarily wait for a specific Sunday in spring to talk about it.
Exactly. The shift to a holiday mindset, an annual observance, is something that evolved later as the church became more institutionalized. It went from a constant state of being to a date on a calendar.
Okay, but clearly things did change. We do have a holiday now, and we have a specific name for it. And this brings us to the linguistic side of things, which I found fascinating because I'm a bit of a word nerd.
Ah, yes. The E word.
This is one of those things that once you hear it, you can't unhear it. In almost every other language on earth, the word for this holiday is totally different than what we say in English, right?
That's right. If you look at French, it's Pâques. Spanish, Pasqua. Italian, Pasqua. In Russian, Pascha. Even in Dutch, it's Pasen.
I see the pattern. They all sound like Passover.
Because they are Passover. In most of the world, the name of the celebration is derived directly from the Hebrew word Pesach, or Pascha in Greek.
It keeps that connection alive.
It does. Keeps that biblical umbilical cord intact. It acknowledges that the resurrection is the fulfillment of the Passover imagery. The linguistic DNA is still there.
But then there's us, English speakers, and the Germans. We just had to be different.
We are the outliers. We use Easter, and the Germans used Ostern.
So where does Easter come from? Because it definitely doesn't sound like Pascha. It sounds like East.
This is where history gets a little murky, but also very revealing. The English term is widely linked by historians to a figure named Eostre, or Ostara. And this is notably mentioned by the 8th century monk known as the Venerable Bede.
And she was a goddess.
According to Bede, yes. A Germanic goddess of spring and the dawn. The word east comes from the same root. The direction of the dawn.
No, I want to pause here because I feel like I've seen memes about this on the internet that claim the whole holiday is just a pagan copy-paste job. Like, haha, you're actually worshiping a bunny goddess.
Right.
But our sources were a bit more nuanced than the memes.
You have to be careful with the copy-paste theory. Here is the credibility check. Historians actually debate how widespread the worship of Eostre was.
We don't really know for sure.
We don't have massive temples dedicated to her that we've dug up all over Europe. We don't have a library of myths about her. Bede is essentially our only written source for this connection. So we shouldn't picture a massive, organized pagan religion that the church just hijacked overnight.
So it wasn't a hostile takeover.
It was likely more of a linguistic drift. As Christianity moved into Northern Europe, it entered a culture that already had names for the months and seasons. The month of April was effectively Eostre month in the local dialect.
Okay, that makes sense.
The celebration of the resurrection happened during that month. Over time, the name of the season just stuck to the holiday.
Like how we say 4th of July. It's a date, but it became the name of the holiday.
Exactly. But the bottom line remains. The word Easter is Germanic. It's not biblical.
That is undisputed.
The apostles Peter and Paul were not walking around wishing people a happy Easter. They wouldn't have had a clue what that word meant. If you said Easter to the apostle John, he'd look at you blankly.
That's jarring to think about. The very name on the church banner is something the founders of the faith wouldn't recognize. It really highlights how culture creeps in, even just through language.
It shows that the faith doesn't exist in a vacuum. It wears the clothes of the culture it inhabits. But language is one thing. Changing the timing of the event, that's a much bigger deal.
Right, let's talk about the timeline. Because this wasn't just a linguistic accident. There was an actual high-stakes decision made to move the holiday, wasn't there?
Yes. This is what historians call the Great Calendar Shift. And it centers on a conflict with a name that sounds like a Transformer villain. The Quartodeciman controversy.
Quartodeciman, break that down for us. It sounds intense.
It comes from the Latin for 14th. It refers to the 14th day of the Jewish month of Nisan.
The start of Passover.
Yes. That is the biblical date when Passover begins. In the 2nd through 4th centuries, there was a massive heated debate among believers about when to observe the resurrection.
A debate about dates. Why was that so heated? People were getting excommunicated over this.
They were. Because the date determined the theology. On one side, you had believers, mostly in Asia Minor places like Ephesus and Smyrna, where the Apostle John had lived. They said, we must keep the remembrance tied strictly to the Jewish Passover timing.
So stick to the 14th of Nisan.
They argued that since Jesus died on Passover, the memorial should be on the 14th of Nisan.
Regardless of the day of the week.
Exactly. If the 14th of Nisan fell on a Tuesday, they celebrated on a Tuesday. It was a Friday, it was a Friday. For them, the anniversary was the point. They were called the Quartodecimans.
Okay, so that's team day. Who was on the other side?
Team Day. This group was growing, particularly in Rome and the West. They argued that since the resurrection happened on a Sunday, the celebration should always be on a Sunday.
I see.
They wanted to prioritize the Lord's Day over the Jewish calendar date. They felt that celebrating the resurrection on a Tuesday just felt wrong.
I can actually see the logic on both sides. One wants historical accuracy, the other wants symbolic consistency. So how did they settle it? Did they just agree to disagree? You do Tuesday, I'll do Sunday.
No, because the Roman Empire didn't like agreeing to disagree. They wanted uniformity. This brings us to the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. This is the big turning point.
Enter Constantine.
Emperor Constantine is involved. He wants a unified church for a unified empire. He looks at this squabble and says, fix it.
And what did Nicaea decide?
They ruled against the Quartodecimans. The celebration was officially and legally separated from the Jewish Passover calendar. They established a new calculation system, basically, the first Sunday after the first full moon of spring, to ensure it always fell on a Sunday.
But the sources mentioned there was something else driving this, right? It wasn't just about Sundays. There was a specific desire to disconnect from Jewish tradition.
Yes, and we have to be honest about the history here. It's uncomfortable, but it's true. Constantine and the council explicitly wanted to avoid relying on Jewish authorities to determine the date. There are letters from Constantine where he basically says, we should have nothing in common with the Jews. He viewed it as undignified for the Christian church to have to ask Jewish rabbis when the month of Nisan began.
That feels like a very deliberate distancing.
It was. It was a major calendar shift that severed the observance from its biblical Hebraic roots. It wasn't just a small administrative tweak. It changed the theological flavor of the event. It became an independent Christian institution regulated by the Roman solar calendar, not the biblical lunar calendar.
That explains so much about why the date of Easter seems to jump around so randomly every year. We're using a calculation from 325 AD that was designed to separate the holiday from Passover.
Exactly. We are living in the legacy of that decision. Every time you have to search online for when Easter is this year, you can thank Constantine.
So we have a Germanic name, a Roman imperial calendar date. And now we need to talk about the things that fill the aisles at the supermarket, the components of the Easter package that seem the most random, the mascots. Yes, the mascots. The bunny and the egg. Now, I think most of us know deep down that these aren't in the Bible, but just to be 100% clear.
Let's be plain. The Easter bunny does not come from Scripture. There is no Book of the Rabbit. You will not find a verse in Acts where the apostles hide colored eggs for the children of Jerusalem.
So if they aren't from the Bible, where did they come from? Why are we hiding eggs on the lawn? Why do we have a mammal delivering eggs? That doesn't even make biological sense.
It really doesn't. But these symbols emerged from European spring folk traditions. You have to remember, in Northern Europe, winter is harsh. It's dark, it's cold, things die. When spring arrives, it's a massive relief. It's an explosion of life.
Life returns to the world.
Right. So the pre-Christian cultures there had powerful symbols for fertility, new life, and seasonal rebirth. Rabbits are famous for, well, rapid reproduction.
They are the ultimate symbol of population growth.
And interestingly, some ancient naturalists, like Pliny the Elder, actually believe rabbits could reproduce without a mate, a sort of virgin birth. Yes, so there was this weird pseudoscientific myth floating around that made them seem mystical. But mostly, they just represent abundance.
And the eggs.
An egg is a self-contained miracle. It looks like a dead stone, but life breaks out of it. It's a potent symbol of the earth waking up. But there's also a practical reason for the eggs that relates to church history, specifically the Lenten fast.
Oh, really? How so?
During the season of Lent, the 40 days before Easter, Christians in the Middle Ages would often fast from animal products. That included eggs.
Ah, so the chickens didn't stop laying just because the humans were fasting?
Exactly. The hens kept working. So by the time Easter Sunday arrived, you had a massive surplus of eggs. They had to be used. So boiling them to preserve them, decorating them, and then eating them became a way to mark the end of the fast. It was a feast food because it had been forbidden for 40 days.
That makes so much sense. So it's a collision of biology, the chickens laying eggs, and theology, the Lenten fast.
It's a cultural fusion. As Christianity spread, it didn't just wipe out local customs. It absorbed them. The celebration of the resurrection, spiritual new life, coincided with spring, physical new life. So the symbols blended.
It's like a visual shorthand. Jesus is alive meets the world is alive.
Precisely. And while that blending is historically understandable, we have to be clear, it is distinct from the biblical narrative. The bunny is a cultural add-on, not a scriptural requirement.
Now, there's one more tradition I want to touch on, and this one feels a lot more religious than the bunny sunrise services.
Yes?
I grew up going to these. You get up way too early, you go to a hill or a park, and you watch the sun come up. It feels very holy.
It does. And out of everything we've discussed, this one actually has the strongest biblical link.
Because the women went to the tomb early, right?
Yes. The Gospels record that the women came to the tomb very early in the morning, while it was still dark or just as the sun was rising. So the timing is technically biblical.
But I sense a but coming. You're going to tell me this is also a modern invention.
There is a nuance here. While the event happened at sunrise, the concept of a formalized annual sunrise ceremony as a fixed religious ritual is a later development. We don't see the disciples holding annual sunrise services in the book of Acts.
So when did that start?
It really picked up steam much later, particularly with Protestant groups like the Moravians in the 18th century. They wanted to recapture that experience of the women at the tomb. They wanted to feel what Mary Magdalene felt.
Meaning, we do the ritual and assume it's exactly what the early church did, but often the ritual is a way we've culturally packaged the memory.
Right. It's a beautiful tradition.
Yeah.
And it honors the text, but it's still a tradition. It's a method of remembrance, not a commandment.
This is a lot to take in. I feel like we've just deconstructed the whole holiday. We've got the name, the date, the symbols. It's all a mix.
It is a mix. And I think for a lot of people, when they hear this kind of information, the knee-jerk reaction is to feel a bit cynical. Like, oh, it's all fake.
Or it's all pagan.
Right. But that's not really the conclusion our sources are pointing toward. We need to synthesize this.
So let's summarize the divide for the listener. If we had to make two lists to keep our heads on straight, to separate the signal from the noise, what goes where?
Okay, let's look at the biblical list first. What is undeniably in the text? The resurrection of Jesus, the empty tomb, the Passover context of the crucifixion, and the command to proclaim this news. That is the bedrock.
Okay, solid ground. Now the cultural and historical list.
On this list, we have the name Easter. We have the specific Sunday calculation system from the Council of Nicaea. We have the bunny and egg symbolism. We have the formalized sunrise rituals. And of course, the entire commercial framework. The sales, the outfits, the candy.
When you lay it out like that, the cultural list is pretty long.
It is. And it tends to be the stuff that takes up the most time and money.
So what does this all mean? I can imagine a listener feeling a bit conflicted. Does this mean we should just cancel the holiday? Is the believer's dilemma that we're participating in something fake?
I don't think the goal is panic. And it's definitely not tradition shaming. There's nothing inherently evil about an egg or a sunrise. The goal here is mature faith.
Mature faith. I like that. What does that look like in this context?
Mature faith is not afraid of investigation. It's about clarity. It's about knowing the difference between what God said and what culture added. You can enjoy a tradition, but you shouldn't confuse it with truth.
Right. Don't base your theology on the Easter bunny.
Exactly. If you know why you were doing something, you are free. You can hide eggs with your kids and know this is a fun folk tradition celebrating spring. You can go to church and know this is the core truth celebrating the resurrection. The danger only comes when you blur them together and treat the bunny like it's sacred.
That distinction is huge. It prevents that feeling of being duped. It allows you to participate without checking your brain at the door.
The source material puts it this way. The resurrection is the core. The rest is padding. And throughout Scripture, God's people were repeatedly called to be intentional about how they worshiped. They were asked to remember His works, not just follow the crowd or the surrounding nations.
That intentionality is key. Because usually we just inherit these things. We grow up, we color the eggs, we go to church, and we never ask why. We just assume it's all one big holy package.
We operate on autopilot, and this deep dive is really an invitation to turn off the autopilot.
So for the listener who is prepping for this season, maybe they've got the baskets ready, maybe they're planning the big ham dinner. This isn't about throwing it all out. It's about engaging with it with eyes wide open.
Yes, be discerning. Ask yourself how much of this practice comes from Scripture and how much simply came along for the ride.
That's a powerful question. How much came along for the ride? It challenges us to strip away the noise and look at the signal.
And here's the final thought from our sources, which I think is just a fantastic gut punch of a reminder. The resurrection of Jesus does not need marketing.
Say that again?
It doesn't need marketing. It doesn't need mascots. It doesn't need cultural padding to be powerful. It stands on its own. The empty tomb is compelling enough without the sugarcoating.
That is such a freeing thought. The event itself is the power. The rest is just, well, decoration.
It is. And sometimes the decoration can obscure the masterpiece. If you have too much pastel grass, you can't see the ground. So maybe this year, try to look past the pastel.
I love that. But it actually brings up one last thought that I want to leave you, the listener, with today. We talked about how the early church celebrated the resurrection constantly, every single week. It wasn't just a once-a-year blowout.
Right.
So the provocative question to mull over is this. By wrapping the resurrection up into this massive, standardized annual holiday, did we inadvertently compartmentalize it? Does having Easter Sunday actually give us an excuse to think less about the empty tomb during the other 51 weeks of the year?
That is a brilliant question. Have we confined it to a season?
Exactly. So to everyone listening, as you navigate the candy aisles and the calendar planning, take a beat. Think about what you're celebrating and why. Trace the lines between truth and tradition. And maybe ask yourself if the reality of the resurrection has escaped the pastel box you keep it in.
Always follow the evidence.
And stay curious. We'll see you on the next deep dive.